Eleanor Whitmore stepped off that train knowing three things. The man waiting for her had been lied to. The photograph she'd sent wasn't hers, and she had exactly nowhere else to go. The entire town of Copper Ridge was staring. She could feel their disgust like dirt on her skin. Silas Crowley stood frozen on the platform, his jaw tight, his eyes moving from her face to the crumpled photograph in his hand. He'd been deceived. She'd deceived him. And now, in front of everyone who mattered in this godforsaken valley, he had to decide whether to honor his word or walk away from the heavy-set woman in the dusty rose dress. But before we see how this impossible situation unfolds, I want to invite you to stick with this story until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's begin. The train's whistle cut through the September cold like a knife scraping bone. Eleanor Whitmore pressed her gloved hand against the window, watching the mountains grow closer with each passing mile. Mended gloves. She'd stitched them herself 3 times now, and the fabric was starting to give up entirely, just like everything else she owned. She hadn't meant to lie. That wasn't quite true. She'd absolutely meant to lie. She just hadn't expected it to work. The photograph she'd sent to Silas Crowley, the one he'd requested after their 4th letter, belonged to her cousin Margaret. Sweet, delicate Margaret, with her narrow waist and pleasant smile. Margaret, who died of typhoid 2 months before Eleanor answered that advertisement in the Rocky Mountain News. Widowed rancher seeks companionable woman of good character for marriage. Must be hardy, willing to work, and comfortable with frontier isolation. Eleanor had all those qualities. She just didn't look like Margaret. The conductor moved through the car, calling out stations. Copper Ridge, Colorado, end of the line. Her stomach twisted. She gathered her carpetbag and stood, smoothing the dusty rose dress she'd worn because it was the only one without visible patches. The fabric pulled across her shoulders. She was broad, always had been. Her mother used to say she was built for labor, not for show, which was a kind way of saying Eleanor would never be the woman men wrote poems about. She stepped onto the platform. The cold hit her first, then the stairs. Copper Ridge wasn't much. A handful of buildings clustered around the station, mountains rising like broken teeth in every direction, and enough wind to make a person question their life choices. But what it lacked in size, it made up for in gossip. Eleanor could feel eyes on her from every window, every doorway. A group of women near the general store stopped talking entirely, their mouths forming perfect O's of shock. And there, standing at the far end of the platform, was Silas Crowley. She knew him immediately. Not from a photograph, he'd never sent one, but from the way he carried himself. Tall, lean, weathered in that way men get when they spend more time with cattle than people. His hat was pulled low, but she could see his face well enough. Strong jaw, dark beard, eyes that looked like they'd forgotten how to trust anything. Those eyes were currently moving between her face and something in his hand. The photograph. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to walk toward him. Her boots were loud on the wooden planks. Behind her, she heard someone whisper, "That's her? That's the mail-order bride?" The phrase stung worse than the cold. Silas didn't move. He just stood there, holding that damned photograph like it was a legal document she'd forged, which, in a way, she had. She stopped 3 feet away from him. "Mr. Crowley." Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. He didn't respond immediately, just kept staring at her, then at the photograph, then back at her. His jaw worked like he was chewing through words he couldn't quite say aloud. Finally, he spoke. "You're Eleanor Whitmore." It wasn't a question. "I am. This..." He held up the photograph. "This isn't you." "No, sir, it isn't." The platform had gone completely silent. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. Eleanor could feel the entire town leaning in, waiting for Silas Crowley to do what any sensible man would do, send her right back on that train. She wouldn't blame him, but she also wouldn't beg. "I crossed the country to get here," she said quietly. "I sold everything I owned to buy that train ticket. I don't have family to go back to. I don't have money for another ticket. I don't have anything except what's in this bag and a willingness to work harder than anyone you've ever met." Silas's expression didn't change. "You lied to me." "Yes. You sent me a photograph of someone else. My cousin. She's dead now. And you thought that made it acceptable? Eleanor lifted her chin. I thought it made me desperate. I was right. Someone behind them laughed, sharp and mean. Silas's shoulders tensed, and for a moment Eleanor thought he might actually tell her to leave. But instead he folded the photograph and shoved it into his coat pocket. The wagon's this way. He turned and walked toward a battered buckboard without waiting to see if she'd follow. Eleanor exhaled slowly, picked up her carpet bag, and went after him. The ride to the ranch was 17 miles of silence and regret. Silas didn't speak, didn't look at her, just kept his eyes on the road while the wagon rattled over rocks and ruts that threatened to shake Eleanor's teeth loose. The landscape around them was brutal in its beauty. Endless sage, jagged peaks, sky so big it made her feel like an insect. She'd grown up in Kansas, where the land was flat and predictable. This place was neither. She tried to start a conversation twice. The mountains are impressive. Nothing. How long have you owned the ranch? Nothing. After the second attempt, she gave up and focused on not falling out of the wagon. The sun was setting by the time they reached the property. Eleanor's first thought was that ranch was a generous term. The main house was a low, sprawling structure that looked like it had been built in pieces over several decades, none of them recently. The barn leaned slightly to the left. Fences sagged. Somewhere in the distance, cattle were lowing, but she couldn't see them through the growing darkness. Silas brought the wagon to a stop near the porch and climbed down without offering to help her. Eleanor managed on her own, her legs stiff from the journey. Bunkhouse is there. Silas pointed to a long, low building near the barn. You'll stay in the main house. There's a spare room off the kitchen. And the marriage? The question hung between them like smoke. Silas finally looked at her directly. His eyes were dark brown, almost black in the fading light, and there was something wounded in them that had nothing to do with her. We'll discuss that later. He grabbed her carpet bag and carried it toward the house without another word. Eleanor followed him inside. The house was warmer than she'd expected, but just as chaotic. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room all at once. Dishes were piled in a wash basin. Papers covered the table. A fire burned in the stone fireplace, providing the only real light. It smelled like coffee, smoke, and loneliness. Room's through there. Silas set her bag down near a narrow doorway. I'll have one of the men bring water for washing. Thank you. He nodded once and started to leave, then stopped. I don't know what we're doing here, Miss Whitmore. I needed a wife. You needed a home. But I won't be lied to again. If this arrangement continues, it continues on truth. I understand. Do you? Eleanor met his gaze and didn't flinch. I lied about a photograph, Mr. Crowley. Not about my character. Not about my willingness to work. Not about being alone in this world. Those things were true in every letter I sent you. Something flickered across his face. Maybe respect. Maybe just exhaustion. We'll see, he said, and left her standing there. Eleanor didn't sleep much that first night. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. She lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch, wind against wood, animals moving in the darkness, men's voices drifting from the bunkhouse. She'd gambled everything on this, and she'd lost before she'd even started. Or had she? Silas hadn't sent her away. That counted for something. He was angry, yes, disappointed, certainly. But he'd brought her to the ranch, given her a room. That meant he was at least considering the possibility of moving forward. She just had to prove herself indispensable before he changed his mind. At dawn, Eleanor rose, dressed, and went to explore the kitchen. She found it exactly as chaotic as it had appeared the night before. Dishes everywhere, supplies disorganized, a stove that looked like it hadn't been properly cleaned in months. The kind of kitchen that happened when men lived alone for too long. She started with the dishes, then the stove. Then she went through the pantry, taking mental inventory of what they had and what they desperately needed. Flour, sugar, coffee, dried beans, salt pork. No vegetables, no fruit, nothing fresh or green or remotely healthy. She was reorganizing the shelves when she heard shouting outside. Not angry shouting, panicked shouting. Eleanor dropped the sack of cornmeal she'd been holding and ran for the door. The scene in the yard stopped her cold. 3 men were carrying a fourth toward the house. The injured man, barely more than a boy, really, was screaming, his face white with pain. His left leg bent at an angle that made Eleanor's stomach turn. "Get him inside." One of the men, older, Mexican, with a thick mustache, was trying to direct the others. Silas, we need—" "I'm here." Silas emerged from the barn, running. He saw the boy and went pale. "What happened?" "Horse threw him into the fence. Legs busted bad." They carried the boy into the house and laid him on the main table, scattering papers everywhere. He was still screaming, thrashing, making the break worse with every movement. Eleanor stepped forward. "Hold him still." Everyone turned to look at her. Silas's expression was somewhere between confusion and irritation. "Miss Whitmore, this isn't—" "Hold him still," she repeated, louder this time. "Someone get me clean water, whiskey, and every piece of clean cloth in this house. Now." The older man with the mustache moved first. "Diego, I'll get the water." "Whiskey's in the cabinet," Silas said, still staring at her. Eleanor didn't wait for permission. She moved to the boy's side and took his hand. He was maybe 16 with sandy hair and freckles and tears streaming down his face. "What's your name?" Tommy." "Tommy, I'm Eleanor. I'm going to set your leg. It's going to hurt worse than anything you've ever felt, but if I don't do it, you'll lose the leg entirely. Do you understand?" Tommy nodded, sobbing. "Good. Bite down on this." She grabbed a wooden spoon from the counter and pressed it between his teeth. Then she looked at Silas. "Hold his shoulders. Don't let him move no matter what. You can't just— Would you rather he dies from infection, or would you rather trust that I know what I'm doing?" Silas held her gaze for a long moment, then moved to Tommy's shoulders and pressed down hard. Eleanor took a breath and felt the leg carefully, identifying the break. Clean fracture, thank heaven. No bone through the skin. She'd seen worse, much worse. "On 3, she said. 1. She didn't wait for 3. She pulled hard and fast, feeling the bone slide back into place. Tommy's scream was inhuman. He thrashed so violently that it took both Silas and another ranch hand to keep him on the table, but the leg was straight. Diego returned with water and cloth. Eleanor washed her hands, then cleaned the area around the break as carefully as she could. Someone handed her the whiskey. She poured it over the wound, then took a long drink herself. "I need something for a splint. 2 straight pieces of wood, about this long." She held her hands apart. One of the men ran outside and came back with fence slats. Eleanor patted them with cloth, positioned them on either side of Tommy's leg, and bound them tight with strips torn from an old sheet. Her hands moved with absolute certainty, no hesitation, no doubt. When she finished, Tommy had passed out from the pain. The room was completely silent. Eleanor straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "He needs to stay off that leg for at least 6 weeks. No riding, no walking unless absolutely necessary. Watch for fever, swelling, red streaks up the leg. If you see any of that, come get me immediately." She looked around at the men staring at her. Someone should probably move him to a bed now. Diego was the first to speak. "Where did you learn to do that?" "My father was a veterinarian. He treated people when there wasn't a doctor available, which was most of the time. I assisted him from the time I was 12. Silas stepped forward. His expression had changed completely. The anger was gone, replaced by something Eleanor couldn't quite read. "You saved his life." "I set a broken bone. He saved his own life by being young and strong. Don't diminish what you just did." Eleanor met his eyes and saw genuine respect there for the first time. It warmed something inside her she'd thought was frozen solid. "I told you I could work, Mr. Crowley. I meant it." Porque. Word spread through the ranch like wildfire. By midday, everyone knew that the strange, heavy woman Silas had brought home, the one who didn't match her photograph, had calmly saved Tommy Reynolds' leg while the men stood around useless and panicking. Diego told the story to anyone who would listen, embellishing slightly with each retelling. Eleanor ignored the attention and focused on work. She finished organizing the kitchen, then moved to the ledgers she'd noticed on the desk in the corner. They were a disaster. Pages missing, numbers that didn't add up, expenses recorded in 3 different hands with no consistency. She'd seen better bookkeeping from children. "You don't need to do that." She looked up to find Silas standing in the doorway, hat in hand. "These books are a mess." I know. When was the last time you reconciled them? Silas shifted uncomfortably. I'm better with cattle than numbers. That's obvious. Eleanor flipped through another page, frowning. You're missing entries for at least 3 months. How do you know if you're making money or bleeding it? I know we're barely holding on. That's all I need to know. Eleanor shook her head and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. Sit down. We're going to fix this. Miss Whitmore? It's Eleanor. And unless you want to lose this ranch to your own poor record keeping, you're going to sit down and help me figure out what's actually happening with your money. For a moment, she thought he'd refuse. Then, slowly, Silas pulled out a chair and sat across from her. They worked until the sun went down. Chag. Over the following days, a rhythm developed. Eleanor would rise before dawn and start coffee. The men would come in for breakfast, biscuits, bacon, eggs when the hens cooperated, and she'd listen to them talk about the day's work. Diego became her unexpected ally, translating when the younger Mexican ranch hand spoke too quickly for her to follow, explaining the peculiarities of running cattle in Colorado's high country. She learned that the ranch ran about 300 head of cattle across grazing land that stretched into the mountains, that they were chronically short-handed, that Silas's father had died 2 years ago, leaving Silas with a failing operation and debts he couldn't discuss. She also learned that Silas Crowley was a better man than he appeared. He was patient with the younger hands, firm but never cruel. He worked harder than anyone else, always the first one out and the last one in. He'd check on Tommy Reynolds twice a day, bringing the boy books and making sure he was healing properly. And late at night, when he thought no one was watching, he'd stand on the porch and stare at the mountains like they held answers to questions he couldn't ask. Eleanor found herself watching him more than she should. On the 4th day, she was in the garden, or what had once been a garden, trying to salvage something from the overgrown chaos, when Diego approached. May I speak plainly, senora? I'm not a senora yet, but yes. Diego crouched beside her, pulling weeds with practiced efficiency. The men respect you. They didn't expect to, but they do. I'm glad to hear it. But there's something you should know about this place, about Silas. Eleanor stopped digging and looked at him. Diego's expression was serious. He's a good man, but he's been hurt. Not just by his father dying, though that was hard enough. There was a woman before. She left him the day before their wedding, said she couldn't live in a place this isolated, with a man this poor. She went back east and married a banker. I see. He doesn't trust easily now, and when you arrived looking different than your photograph, Diego shrugged. It reminded him that people lie, that they misrepresent themselves to get what they want. Eleanor sat back on her heels. I did lie, Diego. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I know. But you're also here, working, helping. You haven't complained once. You saved Tommy's leg. You fixed the books. You cook better than anyone we've had in years. He smiled slightly. Actions matter more than photographs, I think. Does Silas think that? I don't know. But I think he's starting to. Ishak. That evening, Eleanor was cleaning up after supper when Silas came inside carrying a stack of mail. He sorted through it quickly, then stopped, frowning at a particular envelope. What is it? Eleanor asked. Victor Ashcombe. The name meant nothing to her, but Silas's tone suggested it should. Who's Victor Ashcombe? Colonel Victor Ashcombe owns the biggest spread in the valley, fought in the Indian Wars, made a fortune in cattle, and thinks everyone else should bow when he rides past. Silas opened the envelope and read quickly, his frown deepening. He wants to meet. Says he has a proposition for me. What kind of proposition? The kind where he buys my land for half what it's worth, and I should be grateful for the opportunity. Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron and moved closer. Has he made offers before? 3 times in the past year, each one lower than the last. Silas tossed the letter on the table. He knows I'm struggling. He's waiting for me to break. Are you going to meet with him? I don't have much choice. If I refuse, he'll make things difficult. Ashcombe has friends in town, friends in Denver. He can make problems appear out of nowhere. Eleanor picked up the letter and read it herself. The language was polite, almost friendly, but there was something oily underneath it, something that made her skin crawl. When does he want to meet? Tomorrow, 2 o'clock. Then we'll be ready. Silas looked at her sharply. We? I'm your wife, aren't I? or close enough that it makes no difference to people like Ashcombe. If he's coming here to pressure you into selling, I should be present. Eleanor, unless you'd rather I stay in the kitchen where women belong. She raised an eyebrow. I set bones and fix ledgers, Silas. I think I can handle a conversation with a bully in a colonel's uniform. Despite himself, Silas almost smiled. Fine, but let me do the talking. Of course, Eleanor said, in a tone that suggested she'd do no such thing. Victor Ashcombe arrived exactly on time, riding a horse that probably cost more than Eleanor's entire wardrobe. He was older than she'd expected, maybe 60, with silver hair, a carefully trimmed beard, and the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. He wore expensive clothes and moved with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no. Silas! He dismounted smoothly and approached with an extended hand. Good to see you, my boy. Ranch is looking well. It was an obvious lie. The ranch looked half dead, and everyone knew it. Colonel? Silas shook his hand briefly. This is Eleanor Whitmore, my fiancée. Ashcombe's gaze moved to Eleanor, and she saw the calculation happen in real time. He'd expected someone different, someone decorative and silent. Instead, he got a tall, broad woman in a work dress with dirt under her fingernails. Charmed. His smile didn't waver, but his eyes did. I hope Silas is treating you well, Miss Whitmore. Mrs. Crowley, soon enough, Eleanor said evenly. And yes, he is. Wonderful, wonderful. Silas, you didn't mention you were engaged when we last spoke. It's recent. I see. Well, congratulations are in order. Ashcombe clasped his hands behind his back and looked around the property with exaggerated interest. Shall we discuss business, then? They sat on the porch. Eleanor insisted on bringing out chairs rather than standing like petitioners. Ashcombe settled himself comfortably and pulled out a leather document case. I'll be direct, Silas. Your ranch is in trouble. We both know it. Your father left you with debt, and you're short-handed going into winter. Cattle prices are down, and they'll stay down for the foreseeable future. I'm managing, for now. But winter up here is brutal. You'll lose stock. You'll lose men who don't want to freeze for low wages. And come spring, you'll be even deeper in the hole. Ashcombe pulled out a paper and set it on the small table between them. I'm prepared to offer you $15,000 for the property, cash. Enough to pay your debts and start over somewhere easier. Eleanor glanced at the figure and did quick math in her head. The ranch was easily worth $30,000, possibly more if the grazing rights were properly valued. That's a generous offer, Silas said carefully. It is, and it won't be on the table forever. I'll need time to think about it. Of course, but don't take too long. Winter's coming, my boy, and winter up here doesn't wait for anyone. Ashcombe stood, clearly considering the meeting concluded. Eleanor stood as well, but she didn't stay quiet. Colonel Ashcombe, may I ask a question? He looked surprised, but nodded. Of course, dear. Eleanor ignored the condescension. You mentioned cattle prices are down. Are they down for everyone, or just for operations like ours? I'm sorry? Well, if prices are universally down, I imagine your ranch is struggling too. Yet you're offering cash for property. That suggests your operation is quite profitable despite market conditions. I'm curious how you've managed that. Ashcombe's smile froze. Experience, Mrs. Crowley, and scale. Larger operations weather storms more easily. I'm sure they do, especially if they've found ways to supplement their stock without purchasing it. The air on the porch went very still. Ashcombe's expression didn't change, but something cold entered his eyes. I'm not sure I follow your meaning. I'm not sure I have one yet, Eleanor said pleasantly. Just thinking out loud. Thank you for the visit, Colonel. Silas will consider your offer carefully. It was a dismissal, and everyone knew it. Ashcombe stared at her for a long moment, then smiled that same empty smile. Indeed. Good day to you both. He mounted his horse and rode off without looking back. Silas waited until he was out of earshot, then turned to Eleanor. What the hell was that? That was me realizing something doesn't add up. What are you talking about? Eleanor picked up the offer paper and studied it. Cattle prices are down, but Ashcombe has cash to throw around. He's buying property when everyone else is barely surviving, and he's very, very interested in your land specifically. It borders his property. That's valuable. Maybe. Or maybe there's another reason. Eleanor folded the paper and handed it back to Silas. I'd like to look at your books again, specifically your cattle counts over the past few years. Why? Because I think Colonel Ashcombe has been stealing from you, and I think I can prove it. Silas stared at her like she'd just suggested the moon was made of cheese. Stealing cattle? Victor Ashcombe? He shook his head. Eleanor, the man's worth more than half this valley combined. Why would he need to steal from me? I didn't say he needed to. I said I think he did. Eleanor moved past him into the house, heading straight for the desk where she'd been organizing the ledgers. Where do you keep your cattle counts? The records from when your father was alive? In the trunk, under the window. Silas followed her inside, clearly torn between irritation and curiosity. But you're wasting your time. Ashcombe's a lot of things, but he's not a thief. Eleanor opened the trunk and found exactly what she was looking for. 5 years of handwritten records, some in Silas's neat script, most in his father's shakier hand. She spread them across the table and started comparing numbers. How many head did you count last spring? 287. And the spring before that? 312. Eleanor ran her finger down the columns, her frown deepening with each page. What about 3 years ago? I'd have to check 341, and 4 years ago 368. She looked up at him. Silas, you're losing cattle, not just a few, dozens every year. That's normal. We lose some to predators, disease, rough winters. Not this many, not consistently. Eleanor pulled out another ledger, this one containing sale records. You sold 90 head last year, lost maybe 15 to natural causes based on the notes here. That's 105. But your count dropped by 25 more than that. Where did those cattle go? Silas came around the table to look over her shoulder. She could feel the heat of him, smell the mix of leather and sage that seemed to follow him everywhere. He was close enough that she had to concentrate on the numbers instead of the fact that this was the nearest they'd been since that silent wagon ride from the station. Could be a counting error, he said quietly. Every year for 4 years straight? Eleanor shook her head. Someone's been taking your cattle, Silas. Small numbers. Just enough that you'd assume it was normal loss. But add it up, and you're missing close to 100 head over 4 years. Even if you're right, and I'm not saying you are, why Ashcombe? He's got thousands of cattle on his own land. Eleanor tapped the map she'd found tucked into one of the ledgers. It showed the ranch boundaries, the grazing areas, the water sources. Because your land borders his. Look here, she traced a line along the eastern section. This pasture is remote, easy to access from his side. If someone wanted to quietly move cattle across the boundary and rebrand them, this is exactly where they'd do it. Silas was quiet for a long moment, studying the map. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight. My father mentioned missing cattle. 2 years ago, maybe longer. I thought he was just getting old, forgetting where he'd moved the herds. He died before... He stopped. Before I could ask him about it. Did he ever suspect Ashcombe? He never said the name. But he didn't trust him. Used to say the colonel smiled too much for a man who'd seen as much blood as he had. Silas straightened, running a hand through his hair. Even if you're right, what am I supposed to do? Accuse the most powerful man in the territory of being a cattle thief? I've got no proof. Just missing numbers in a ledger. Then we get proof. How? Eleanor looked him dead in the eye. We ride out to that eastern pasture and see what we find. Silas laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want to go check if Ashcombe's rebranding my cattle? Eleanor, if we're caught on his land, we won't go on his land. We'll stay on yours. Check the brands on the cattle in that remote section. If I'm wrong, then I'm wrong. But if I'm right, she let the implication hang between them. If you're right, we'll have a war on our hands. You already have a war. You just didn't know you were fighting it. Silas studied her face like he was seeing her for the first time. Really seeing her. Not the woman who didn't match the photograph, not the stranger who'd showed up uninvited, but someone who might actually understand what he was up against. Diego knows that pasture, he said finally. We'll need him with us, and we'll need to go at first light before the hands start moving cattle around. Agreed. And if I'm doing this, we're doing it right. Guns, supplies, and you stay behind me if there's trouble. Eleanor opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. Pick your battles. her father used to say. She'd won the important one. He was listening to her. She could fight about the rest later. Fine. Silas nodded once, then grabbed his hat. I need to talk to Diego. Get some rest. Dawn comes early up here. He was halfway to the door when Eleanor spoke again. Silas? He turned. Thank you for trusting me on this. His expression softened just slightly. You saved Tommy's leg. You fixed my books. You stood up to Ashcombe when most women would have stayed quiet. He paused. Maybe I should have trusted you sooner. Then he was gone, leaving Eleanor alone with the ledgers and a gnawing certainty that tomorrow was going to change everything. She looked down at the numbers spread across the table. Her father had taught her that numbers didn't lie. People did. Numbers just told you what already happened, clean and clear and indifferent to who got hurt by the truth. The truth here was that someone had been bleeding this ranch dry for years, and tomorrow she was going to prove it. Eleanor barely slept that night. She kept running scenarios through her head, what they'd find, what they wouldn't find, what Ashcombe would do if he discovered they were investigating him. The man had money, power, and the kind of influence that could destroy a small rancher without breaking a sweat. She'd insulted him, however politely, on that porch. Men like Ashcombe didn't forget insults. She finally gave up on sleep around 4 in the morning and went to make coffee. Diego was already in the kitchen, checking his rifle. Couldn't sleep either? She asked. I slept fine, just like thinking before I do something stupid. He looked at her with those sharp, dark eyes. You really think Ashcombe's stealing cattle? I think the numbers don't lie. Numbers can be wrong. Not this wrong, not this consistently. Eleanor poured coffee for both of them. You've been here longer than Silas. Did his father ever mention it? Diego was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. Once. Maybe 8 months before he died. He came back from checking the eastern pasture and said something felt off. Said he'd counted the herd 3 times and kept coming up short. But then winter hit and he got sick and... He shrugged. We thought it was just old age making him forgetful. It wasn't. No, I'm starting to think it wasn't. Silas emerged from his room a few minutes later, already dressed and armed. He looked like he'd slept about as well as Eleanor had, which was to say, not at all. His eyes were shadowed, his jaw tight, but his hands were steady as he checked his rifle and filled his pockets with ammunition. We ready? He asked. As we'll ever be, Diego replied. Eleanor stood. What do you need me to do? Silas looked at her for a long moment. Can you ride? Well enough. Then you're coming with us, but you follow my lead, and if I tell you to run, you run. Understood? Understood. It was a lie, and they both knew it. But Silas didn't call her on it. He just handed her a rifle and led the way to the barn. The ride to the eastern pasture took nearly 2 hours. The land rose steadily as they went, climbing into rougher territory where the sage gave way to scrub pine and the ground turned rocky and mean. Eleanor's horse, a steady gray mare named Patience, picked her way carefully over the uneven terrain. Eleanor had ridden before, but not like this. Not in mountains where one wrong step could send you tumbling down a slope that ended in broken bones or worse. But she kept her mouth shut and her eyes forward. Complaining wouldn't help anything. The sun was just starting to turn the eastern sky pink when they reached the pasture. It wasn't much to look at, just a wide, shallow valley surrounded by hills, with a stream cutting through the center. Maybe 30 or 40 cattle were scattered across the area, grazing peacefully in the early morning light. Diego dismounted first, scanning the area with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent his entire life working cattle. Looks quiet. Let's check the brands, Silas said. They split up, moving slowly through the herd. Eleanor stayed close to Silas, watching as he examined each animal. Most bore the Crowley brand clearly, a simple C with a bar through it. But then Silas stopped beside a large steer and went very still. Diego, come look at this. Diego rode over, dismounted, and knelt beside the animal. Eleanor moved closer, peering over their shoulders at the brand on the steer's left hip. At first it looked normal, but when Diego brushed the hair aside and traced the mark with his finger, Eleanor could see it. The Crowley brand was there, faint but visible, and burned directly over it, fresh enough that the hair hadn't fully grown back, was another mark, a V with an arrow through it. Ashcombe's brand. Son of a bitch, Diego breathed. Silas's face had gone completely white. Check the others, all of them. They spent the next hour examining every animal in the pasture. Out of 37 cattle, 11 showed signs of rebranding. The work was skillful. You had to look closely to see the original marks underneath. But it was there, undeniable. Eleanor's hands were shaking by the time they finished. Not from fear, from rage. "He's been stealing from you for years," she said quietly, "taking your cattle, changing the brands, moving them onto his land. How many times has he done this?" "Enough." Silas's voice was flat, emotionless in the way people get when they're too angry to feel anything else. "Enough to push us to the edge of bankruptcy while he gets richer." Diego stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "What do we do?" It was a fair question. They had proof now, but what good was proof against a man like Ashcombe? The local sheriff was in his pocket. The nearest federal marshal was in Denver, days away. And if they accused him publicly without ironclad evidence, Ashcombe could crush them with lawsuits, intimidation, or worse. Eleanor's mind was already working through the options. We need documentation, photographs if we can get them, written statements, something that can't be disputed. "And then what?" Silas asked. "Take it to a sheriff who owes Ashcombe favors? A judge who probably does business with him? No, we take it to the federal marshals. This is interstate cattle fraud. Some of these animals probably crossed state lines when you bought them. That makes it a federal crime." Eleanor met his gaze. "But we need more than 11 rebranded steers. We need to prove he's been doing this systematically. That means going through every animal on your ranch, documenting the evidence, and building a case so solid even Ashcombe's lawyers can't break it. That could take weeks." "Then we work fast." Silas looked at Diego. "Can you get the men to help? Without word getting back to Ashcombe?" Diego nodded slowly. "Most of them hate the colonel anyway. They'll help. But we need to be careful. Ashcombe's got eyes everywhere." "Then we keep this quiet. Tell the men we're doing a full count for inventory purposes. Nothing about the rebranding until we know who we can trust." Silas turned his horse back toward the ranch. "Let's move. The sooner we start, the sooner we finish this." They were halfway back when Eleanor noticed the rider on the ridge. She didn't say anything at first, just watched the distant figure sitting motionless on horseback, silhouetted against the brightening sky. Too far away to identify, but close enough to have seen them. "Silas," she said quietly. He followed her gaze and went rigid. "Diego, you see him?" "I see him." "One of Ashcombe's men?" "Probably." The rider watched them for another long moment, then turned and disappeared over the ridge. "He's going to tell Ashcombe we were out here," Eleanor said. "Let him." Silas's voice was hard. "We weren't on Ashcombe's land. We were checking our own cattle. That's not a crime." "No, but it means Ashcombe knows we're looking." "Good. Maybe it'll make him nervous." Nervous people make mistakes. Eleanor hoped he was right. But as they rode back toward the ranch, she couldn't shake the feeling that they'd just set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. Ashcombe wasn't the type to get nervous. He was the type to eliminate threats. And right now, they were definitely a threat. The next 2 weeks were the hardest Eleanor had ever worked. Every morning, she'd ride out with Silas, Diego, and a rotating crew of ranch hands to check cattle. They'd examine brands, take notes, document locations. Eleanor kept meticulous records, which animals showed rebranding, where they were found, estimated dates based on hair growth and scar tissue. She treated it like a medical case, because in a way, it was. Evidence of trauma. A body that told a story if you knew how to read it. The men started looking at her differently during those weeks, not as the strange woman who'd shown up with a false photograph, but as someone who knew what she was doing, someone who didn't quit when the work got hard. Tommy Reynolds, whose leg was healing well enough that he could hobble around the house, helped her organize the documentation. He'd sit at the kitchen table for hours, carefully copying Eleanor's notes into a clean ledger that could be presented as evidence. "Why's the colonel doing this?" he asked one afternoon. "He's already rich." "Some men always want more," Eleanor replied. "Doesn't matter how much they have. They see something they want, they take it." "That's stealing." "Yes, it is. My pa always said stealing was the worst thing a man could do, worse than fighting or drinking or even killing sometimes, because it meant you thought you were better than the rules everyone else had to follow." Eleanor looked at this boy, barely 16, still limping from his injury, trying to understand how the world could be so unfair. Your pa was right. By the end of the second week, they had documented 43 rebranded cattle, 43 animals that had started as Crowley property and been systematically stolen and remarked. Based on Eleanor's calculations, that represented roughly $12,000 in theft over the past 4 years, maybe more. It was enough to ruin a struggling ranch, which, she suspected, was exactly the point. Silas was sitting on the porch that evening, cleaning his rifle, when Eleanor brought him the final count. 43, he said quietly, staring at the number. 43. That we found. There might be more that we missed, or that he's already sold off. Silas set down the rifle and rubbed his face. He looked exhausted. My father knew. He had to have known, toward the end. That's why he was so worried about the ranch failing. It wasn't just bad luck or bad management. Someone was sabotaging us from the inside. Eleanor sat down beside him. The evening was cool, the sky turning that particular shade of purple that only happened in the mountains. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "What can I do? Ride into town and accuse the most powerful man in the territory? He'll deny it. His lawyers will bury me. And even if I could prove it, by the time the case goes to trial, I'll be bankrupt." "So you're just going to let him get away with it?" "I didn't say that." Silas looked at her. "But I need to be smart about this. Rushing and angry gets people killed." Eleanor couldn't argue with that logic, but sitting still felt impossible when she knew what Ashcombe had done. "There has to be a way. If there is, I haven't found it yet." They sat in silence for a while. Then Eleanor spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "What if we didn't go to local authorities? What if we went straight to the federal marshals? Sent them the documentation, requested an investigation? That could take months, maybe longer. But they'd have to investigate. This is federal jurisdiction, interstate commerce, livestock fraud. They can't ignore it." Silas considered this. "Maybe. But we'd need more than just our word in a ledger. We'd need witnesses willing to testify, evidence that could hold up in court." "Then we get it." Eleanor leaned forward. "Diego's been here for years. He can testify about the missing cattle, the pattern of losses. Tommy can testify about what we found. And I can testify as someone with no previous connection to this valley, no reason to lie. Ashcombe's lawyers would tear you apart. Let them try." Silas almost smiled at that. "You're not afraid of much, are you?" "I'm afraid of plenty. I'm just better at being angry than being scared." Eleanor stood. "But right now, I'm going to make dinner. You should eat something. You're getting too thin." She was halfway to the door when Silas called her name. "Yeah? Thank you for all of this, for..." He gestured vaguely at the ranch, the ledgers, everything. "For caring." Eleanor felt something warm settle in her chest, something she wasn't quite ready to name. "You gave me a home when I had nowhere else to go," she said quietly. "This is the least I can do." She went inside before he could respond, her heart beating faster than it should. The next morning, everything changed. Eleanor woke to the sound of shouting. She threw on her dress and ran outside to find Silas, Diego, and 3 ranch hands standing in the yard, staring at something in the distance. Smoke. Thick black smoke rising from the direction of the eastern pasture. "Someone's burning the grass," Diego said, his voice tight. "Not just burning it. Look at the pattern." Silas pointed. "They're driving fire toward our cattle. If it spreads to the pine..." He didn't need to finish. A fire in the dry timber would destroy everything. "Get everyone up," Silas barked. "Wet down the barn, the house, anything that can burn. Diego, you're with me. We need to get those cattle out before they're trapped." "I'm coming too," Eleanor said. "No, you're staying here." "Like hell I am. You need every hand you've got. I can ride, I can drive cattle, and I'm not standing around while you risk your neck alone." Silas looked like he wanted to argue, but there wasn't time. "Fine, but you stay close to Diego. You hear me?" Eleanor was already running for the barn. The ride to the pasture was terrifying. The smoke was worse than it had looked from the ranch. Thick enough to choke on, hot enough to make the horses nervous. They could hear cattle bellowing in panic, see flames licking through the dry grass on the far side of the valley. "They're trapped," Diego shouted over the roar of the fire. "We need to turn them toward the stream." They split up, riding hard around the panicked herd. Eleanor had never done anything like this before. Never tried to redirect frightened animals while smoke burned her lungs and heat singed her face. But she'd watched the men work for weeks now. She understood the principle. Get ahead of the leaders, turn them, and the rest would follow. She pushed Patience hard, racing around the edge of the herd. A burning branch fell directly in front of her horse. Patience reared, nearly throwing her, but Eleanor held on and forced the mare forward. She reached the lead steers and started yelling, waving her arms, doing everything she could to turn them toward the water. It worked. Slowly, too slowly, the herd began to shift direction. Silas appeared through the smoke, his face black with soot. "Get them to the stream! Once they're in the water, they'll be safe!" They drove the cattle toward the creek, pushing them into the shallow water where the flames couldn't reach. 37 animals. Every one of them survived. But when Eleanor turned to look back at the pasture, her heart sank. The entire valley was burning. Diego rode up beside her, coughing. Someone set this deliberately, multiple ignition points. This wasn't an accident. "Ashcombe," Eleanor said. "Maybe, or maybe he just hired someone to do his dirty work." Diego wiped soot from his face. "Either way, this is a message." "What kind of message?" "The kind that says stop looking, or next time it won't just be grass." Eleanor's hands tightened on the reins. She looked at Silas, who was staring at the burning pasture with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not fear, not even anger, something colder, calculation. "We need to get back to the ranch," he said quietly. "Now." They rode back in silence, the smoke following them like a ghost. When they reached the ranch, Silas dismounted and went straight to his room. He came out 5 minutes later carrying a gun belt and a rifle. "What are you doing?" Eleanor asked. "What I should have done weeks ago." His voice was flat. "I'm riding to Ashcombe's ranch. I'm going to look him in the eye and tell him I know what he's been doing. And I'm going to make it very clear that if he comes near my property again, I'll kill him." "That's a terrible idea." "It's the only idea I have left." Eleanor stepped in front of him, blocking his path to the door. "You ride over there armed and angry. You're not coming back. He'll either kill you or he'll have you arrested for threatening him. Either way, you lose." "Then what do you suggest?" Eleanor's mind was racing. They needed leverage. They needed something that would make Ashcombe back down without violence. Something that would hurt him more than bullets could. And then she saw it, clear as daylight. "We go public," she said. "Not with local authorities, with everyone. We write up everything we've found, the rebranded cattle, the pattern of theft, the fire today. We send copies to newspapers in Denver, to the territorial governor, to the federal marshals, to every cattlemen's association in the region. We make so much noise that Ashcombe can't silence us without making it worse." Silas stared at her. "That would start a war." "The war already started. We're just choosing to fight it on our terms instead of his." Eleanor held his gaze. "But it has to be airtight, every fact verified, every witness willing to testify. We get one shot at this, Silas. If we do it wrong, he buries us. If we do it right, we bury him." "Exactly." Diego had been listening from the doorway. "She's right. Violence plays into his hands, but evidence? Truth? That's something he can't fight as easily." Silas lowered the rifle slowly. The rage was still there in his eyes, but it was controlled now, focused. "How long would it take to prepare?" "A week. Maybe less if we work around the clock." Eleanor moved to the desk and started pulling out papers. "We document everything, every rebranded animal, every witness statement, every financial record that shows the pattern. We build a case so solid, even a corrupt judge can't ignore it. And if Ashcombe comes after us before we're ready, then we defend ourselves. But we don't go looking for a fight we might not win." Eleanor looked at both men. "Are you with me?" Diego nodded immediately. Silas took longer, the internal war visible on his face. But finally, he set down the rifle and joined her at the desk. "Let's get to work." They worked through the night and into the next day, stopping only when their hands cramped or their eyes refused to focus anymore. Eleanor organized everything with the precision of a field surgeon. Witness statements in one pile, financial records in another, maps and brand documentation in a third. Tommy copied the final versions in his careful script, while Diego tracked down every ranch hand who'd witnessed the rebranding or the fire. By the third day, they had something that looked less like scattered evidence and more like a legal indictment. Eleanor sat back in her chair, rubbing her temples. Her head ached from squinting at numbers by lamplight, and her fingers were stained with ink. Across the table, Silas was reviewing the witness statements for what had to be the 10th time. "This is good," he said quietly. "This is really good. It needs to be better than good." Eleanor reached for the coffee pot and found it empty. Again. "We need it to be undeniable. Short of catching Ashcombe in the act, I don't know what more we can do." Diego entered the kitchen carrying a sealed envelope. "Just got back from town, mailed the copies like you asked. One to the federal marshal in Denver, one to the territorial governor, one to the Denver Post. Anyone see you?" "Half the town, probably. But I used different couriers for each delivery. Told them it was ranch business. Nothing urgent." Diego set the envelope on the table. "This came for you, Silas. Hand-delivered to the post office this morning." Silas took the envelope and turned it over. No return address. Just his name written in elegant script across the front. He broke the seal and pulled out a single piece of heavy paper. His face went white. "What is it?" Eleanor asked. Silas handed her the letter without speaking. Eleanor read it once, then twice, her stomach turning with each word. The message was short and polite and absolutely terrifying. "Mr. Crowley, I understand you've been experiencing difficulties with your livestock. Perhaps we should discuss this matter in person before unfortunate misunderstandings escalate further. I'll be visiting your ranch tomorrow at noon with several of my men. I trust you'll receive us with appropriate hospitality. Yours in friendship, Colonel Victor Ashcombe." "He knows," Eleanor said. "He knows we're building a case." "Of course he knows." Silas's voice was flat. "Someone in town must have seen Diego mailing those letters. Or maybe he's got people watching the ranch. Doesn't matter. He's coming here tomorrow with armed men, and we both know it's not for a friendly conversation." Diego swore in Spanish. "How many men does he usually travel with?" "The letter says several. Could be 3, could be a dozen." Silas stood and walked to the window, staring out at the mountains. "We've got 5 hands we can count on. Maybe 6 if Tommy can hold a rifle steady enough." "That's not enough," Eleanor said. "Not if Ashcombe's bringing an army." "No, it's not." The room fell silent. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Eleanor's mind was racing through possibilities, discarding each one as quickly as it formed. They couldn't fight Ashcombe's men head-on. They couldn't run. This was Silas's land, his home, his father's legacy. And they couldn't count on help from town, not when half the businesses there probably owed Ashcombe money or favors. "What if we don't let him get to the ranch?" she said suddenly. Silas turned. "What?" "He's expecting us to be here waiting for him. What if we're not? What if we take the fight somewhere else on our terms?" "You want to ambush him?" "No, I want to confront him where he can't control the situation." Eleanor stood and moved to the map still spread across the table. "The eastern pasture. The one that's been burning. It's on our land, but it borders his property. If we meet him there in the open, with witnesses, he'll just shoot us and claim self-defense. Not if we bring the whole valley with us." Diego's eyes widened. "You want to make it public?" "Exactly. We send word to every rancher, every business owner, every person who's ever been pushed around by Ashcombe. We tell them there's going to be a confrontation at the eastern pasture tomorrow at noon, and we invite them to witness it." Eleanor looked at Silas. "He can't massacre us in front of 50 witnesses. And if he backs down in front of the entire valley, he loses the one thing he values more than money, his reputation." Silas was quiet for a long moment, thinking it through. "That's insane." "Probably. If it goes wrong, people could die. If we do nothing, people definitely die. Us, specifically." Silas looked at Diego. "What do you think?" The older man stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "I think Eleanor's right. Ashcombe's power comes from fear and isolation. He controls people by making them think they're alone against him. But if the valley sees that he's just a bully with a stolen fortune," Diego shrugged, "maybe that fear breaks. Or maybe we start a range war that gets everyone killed." "Maybe," Diego agreed. "But we're already in a war. We're just choosing to fight it in daylight instead of shadows." Silas exhaled slowly, then nodded. "All right. We do it your way. But we need to move fast. Diego, ride to the neighboring ranches, the Johnsons, the Martinez family. Old Sullivan, if he's sober. Tell them what's happening. Tell them we need witnesses, not gunfighters. Eleanor, you write up a statement we can read publicly. Make it clear. Make it simple. Make it damning. I'll gather the men and make sure everyone's armed in case this goes sideways. They scattered to their tasks. Eleanor sat down with fresh paper and began writing. Her hand was shaking slightly, but her words were steady. She wrote about the rebranded cattle, the systematic theft, the fire that had nearly killed them all. She wrote about Ashcombe's threats and his offer to buy the ranch for a fraction of its value. And she wrote about why they were making this public, not for revenge, but for justice. When she finished, she read it aloud to herself. It was clear, direct, accusatory, in a way that would force Ashcombe to respond. Either he'd deny everything publicly, making himself look weak, or he'd try to silence them by force, making himself look guilty. Either way, he'd lose. At least that was the plan. Eleanor folded the statement carefully and set it aside. Through the window, she could see Silas in the yard, talking with the ranch hands. His posture was tense, his gestures sharp. He was scared. She could tell. But he was moving forward anyway, doing what needed to be done even though it terrified him. She wondered if he knew how brave that made him. The sun was setting when Diego returned with news. Got word to 6 ranches. Johnson and Martinez are coming. Sullivan, too, surprisingly. Said he's tired of Ashcombe pushing people around. A few others might show up. Hard to say. That's something, Silas said. It's more than something. These are families Ashcombe's been squeezing for years. If they're willing to stand with us publicly, others might follow. Eleanor joined them on the porch. What about the town? Harder to say. Some folks are loyal to Ashcombe because he's rich. Others are just scared. But I spread the word at the saloon before I left. By morning, half the territory will know there's going to be a confrontation. Diego grinned without humor. Gossip travels faster than horses around here. Good. Eleanor looked at Silas. We should get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be long. But none of them slept much that night. Eleanor lay in her narrow bed listening to the house settle and creak, thinking about everything that could go wrong. Ashcombe could bring 20 men instead of 5. He could start shooting before anyone had a chance to speak. He could have already bought off the federal marshal in the newspapers, making their evidence worthless. Or maybe, just maybe, this would work. She was still awake when she heard Silas moving around the main room. She got up, threw a shawl over her nightgown, and found him sitting at the table with a bottle of whiskey he wasn't drinking. Couldn't sleep either, she asked. He looked up, unsurprised to see her. Kept thinking about my father. He spent 30 years building this ranch, broke his back, broke his health, and in the end, some bastard with a fancy title stole it out from under him piece by piece. Silas finally poured himself a small measure of whiskey. I should have seen it sooner. You couldn't have known. I should have listened to him. He tried to tell me something was wrong, and I thought he was just getting old. Silas drank, grimacing. Now I'm about to risk everything on a plan that might get us all killed. Eleanor sat down across from him. You're risking everything to protect what's yours. That's not foolish. That's survival. Is it? Or is it pride? Maybe I should have just taken Ashcombe's offer and left. And let him win. Let him keep stealing from the next person and the next until he owns the whole valley? Eleanor shook her head. You're not fighting for pride, Silas. You're fighting because someone has to. Because if everyone just accepts that men like Ashcombe can do whatever they want, then what's the point of laws or justice or any of it? Silas looked at her for a long moment. When you got off that train, I thought you were the worst thing that could have happened to me. I remember. I was wrong. You're the best thing that's happened to this ranch in years. Maybe ever. He paused. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. Eleanor felt heat rise in her face. You gave me a home when I had nothing. You could have sent me back on that train, and you didn't. That's more than most men would have done. I almost did send you back. But you didn't. They sat there in the lamplight, not quite looking at each other, the words they weren't saying hanging heavy in the air between them. Eleanor wanted to reach across the table, take his hand, tell him that somewhere in the past few weeks she'd stopped thinking of this as a business arrangement and started thinking of it as something else entirely. But tomorrow they might both be dead, so what was the point? We should try to rest, she said instead. Even just a few hours. Silas nodded but didn't move. Eleanor? Yeah? If this goes wrong tomorrow, if Ashcombe starts shooting, I want you to run. Don't try to be brave. Don't try to help. Just get on a horse and ride as far from here as you can. I'm not running. Eleanor? No. She stood, her jaw set. I'm not leaving you to face this alone. We started this together, and we're finishing it together. So you can save your chivalrous speeches for someone who will actually listen to them. Despite everything, Silas almost smiled. You're impossibly stubborn. So I've been told. She left him there with his whiskey and his worries, went back to her room, and somehow managed to sleep for a few hours before dawn. When she woke, the house was already alive with activity. Ranch hands were loading rifles, checking ammunition, saddling horses. Tommy was up, despite his still healing leg, helping where he could. Diego was organizing supplies like they were heading into battle, which, in a way, they were. Eleanor dressed quickly and joined them. Silas was in the yard giving instructions, his voice calm, but his eyes dark with tension. When he saw her, he handed her a rifle. You know how to use this? Well enough. Keep it loaded, keep it close, and if I tell you to use it, don't hesitate. Eleanor took the rifle, feeling the weight of it. She'd fired guns before. Her father had taught her to hunt small game when she was young, but she'd never pointed one at a person. She hoped today wouldn't be the first time. They rode out just after 9 in the morning. The plan was to reach the eastern pasture early, set up a position where they could be seen clearly, and wait. Wait for Ashcombe. Wait for the witnesses Diego had summoned. Wait to see if this insane gamble would actually work. The valley was already filling with people when they arrived. Eleanor had expected maybe a dozen. But as they crested the ridge overlooking the burned pasture, she counted at least 30 horses, maybe more. Ranchers she recognized from Diego's descriptions. Townspeople who'd ridden out to see what would happen. Even a few cowboys who worked for other spreads come to watch the show. Word really did spread, Silas muttered. Good, Eleanor said. The more people who see this, the harder it is for Ashcombe to control the narrative. They took up position near the stream where they'd saved the cattle from the fire. The burned grass was still black and ugly, a stark reminder of what Ashcombe was capable of. Diego positioned the ranch hands in a loose line, visible but not aggressive. Tommy sat on a wagon bed with the rifle across his lap, looking simultaneously terrified and determined. Eleanor stood next to Silas, the written statement folded in her pocket. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, and then they waited. 11:30 came and went. The crowd grew restless, talking among themselves. Someone made a joke Eleanor couldn't quite hear, and nervous laughter rippled through the group. At 11:45, a rider appeared on the southern ridge, then another, and another. By the time they finished arriving, Ashcombe had brought 9 men, all of them armed, all of them looking like they knew how to use those weapons. The valley went quiet. Colonel Victor Ashcombe rode down into the pasture on his expensive horse, his silver hair gleaming in the midday sun. He looked completely at ease, like this was just another business meeting. But Eleanor could see the calculation in his eyes as he surveyed the crowd. He hadn't expected this many witnesses. Good. Let him be surprised. Ashcombe stopped about 20 feet away from Silas, close enough to talk, far enough that drawing a gun would be obvious to everyone watching. Quite the gathering, Mr. Crowley, Ashcombe said pleasantly. I wasn't aware this was a public event. It is now. Silas's voice carried across the valley. Since the matter we're discussing concerns the whole territory. Oh? And what matter is that? The fact that you've been stealing my cattle for the past 4 years. The crowd murmured. Ashcombe's pleasant expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. That's a serious accusation. I assume you have evidence? We do. Eleanor stepped forward, pulling out the statement. Her hands were steady now, her voice clear. 43 head of cattle on the Crowley Ranch show evidence of rebranding. Original Crowley marks burned over with your brand. We've documented each one, photographed the brands, and gathered witness statements from multiple ranch hands. Interesting story. Ashcombe's smile was sharp. But brands can be misread. Cattle can be purchased and rebranded legitimately. Do you have any proof that these animals were stolen rather than bought? We do. Silas nodded to Diego, who pulled out the ledgers. These are 4 years of ranch records showing steady, unexplained losses. Losses that correspond exactly with increases in your own herd. And we have shipping records from the stockyards in Denver showing you've been selling cattle in numbers that don't match your own breeding records. Ashcombe's jaw tightened. Ranch records can be falsified. Shipping records can be misinterpreted. This is nothing but speculation and jealousy from a failing rancher looking to blame his problems on a successful neighbor. Then explain the fire, Eleanor said. The fire that destroyed the eastern pasture 3 days ago. Multiple ignition points deliberately set. We have witnesses who saw riders leaving the area just before the blaze started, riders matching the description of your men. I know nothing about any fire. Perhaps you should be more careful with your own property. Or perhaps you should be more careful about leaving evidence. Eleanor held up a piece of charred fabric. This was found at one of the ignition points. It's from a saddle blanket, and it has your ranch's mark stitched into the corner. The crowd gasped. Ashcombe's face went red. That proves nothing. Anyone could have planted that. Could have, but didn't. Silas stepped forward. Here's what I think happened, Colonel. You've been stealing cattle from struggling ranches for years. Small amounts, nothing that would attract attention individually. You'd rebrand them, mix them into your own herd, sell them at market. Easy money. But my father started to notice, started asking questions. So you increased the pressure, made me an offer for the land. When I didn't sell, you escalated, burned my pasture, tried to scare me into giving up. This is absurd. We've sent copies of all our evidence to the federal marshal in Denver, the territorial governor, and the Denver Post, Eleanor interrupted. They'll be investigating whether you want them to or not. But we thought the people of this valley deserved to know the truth first. Deserved to know that the man they've been afraid of for years is nothing but a common thief. The silence that followed was absolute. Ashcombe looked around at the crowd, seeing the doubt in their faces, seeing the way people were whispering to each other, pointing at the burned grass, at the evidence Diego was holding. His power had always come from fear and reputation, and Eleanor had just shattered both in front of everyone who mattered. You have no idea what you've done, Ashcombe said quietly, his voice shaking with rage. I have lawyers. I have connections. I have friends in places you can't even imagine. This evidence won't mean anything. I'll crush you. I'll take everything you have and scatter it to the wind. Maybe? Silas's voice was steady. But you'll have to do it in front of all these witnesses, in front of federal investigators, in front of newspapers that are going to be very interested in a decorated colonel who turned cattle thief. He paused. Your reputation is already destroyed, Ashcombe. The only question now is whether you make it worse by threatening us in front of half the valley. Ashcombe's hand moved toward his gun. Every man on Silas's side raised their rifles in unison. The crowd scattered, people diving for cover. Eleanor's heart stopped, but Ashcombe didn't draw. His hand hovered there for a long moment, trembling with barely contained fury. Then, slowly, he lowered it. This isn't over, he said. Yes, Eleanor replied. It is. Ashcombe stared at her with pure hatred. Then he turned his horse and rode away, his men following. They disappeared over the ridge, leaving nothing but dust and silence behind them. The crowd erupted. People were shouting, talking, arguing. Some were congratulating Silas, others were debating whether the evidence was real. But everyone was talking about it. The story was out now, spreading like the fire Ashcombe had set, and there was no stopping it. Diego clasped Silas's shoulder. You did it. We did it, Silas corrected, looking at Eleanor. But Eleanor wasn't celebrating. She was watching the ridge where Ashcombe had disappeared, a cold certainty settling in her stomach. This isn't over, she said quietly. He's not the type to just accept defeat. What do you mean? I mean, he's going to come back. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow. But he's going to come back, and when he does, he won't be worried about witnesses or evidence or reputation. Eleanor met Silas's eyes. We humiliated him in front of the entire valley. Men like that don't forgive humiliation. Silas's expression darkened. Then we'll be ready. They rode back to the ranch in a state of tense victory. They'd won the public confrontation, but Eleanor was right. Ashcombe wouldn't let this stand. He'd regroup, plan, come back harder. The question was when. The answer came 4 days later. Eleanor was in the kitchen making bread when she heard horses approaching. Too many horses. She wiped flour from her hands and looked out the window. 6 riders, armed, moving fast toward the house. Silas, she shouted. He appeared from the barn, saw the riders, and immediately started barking orders. Diego, get the men! Eleanor, inside now! But Eleanor had already grabbed the rifle from beside the door. She took up position by the window, watching as the riders approached. They weren't Ashcomb's men. The lead rider wore a badge. Federal Marshal. Hold your fire, Eleanor called out. It's the law. The riders stopped in the yard. The marshal dismounted, flanked by 2 deputies. He was a tall man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much. Silas Crowley? He called out. Silas emerged from cover, hands visible, rifle lowered. That's me. Deputy Marshal William Garrett, out of Denver. I'm here about a complaint filed regarding cattle theft and interstate fraud. He looked around at the armed ranch hands. You folks planning to shoot a federal officer? Depends on why you're here, Silas replied. I'm here to investigate. Got your evidence package 3 days ago. Interesting reading. Garrett gestured to one of his men, who pulled out a leather satchel. But I also got this. Complaint filed by Colonel Victor Ashcombe claiming you've been making false accusations to damage his reputation. Says you've been stealing his cattle and trying to cover it up by framing him. Eleanor felt her stomach drop. That's a lie, she said. Garrett looked at her. And you are? Eleanor Whitmore, soon to be Mrs. Crowley. I'm the one who documented the evidence. Then you're the one I need to talk to. Garrett dismounted and approached the porch. Because according to Ashcomb's filing, you're a con artist who arrived here under false pretenses and has been manipulating Mr. Crowley into believing these wild stories. That's not... I need to see your evidence. All of it. The original documents, not copies. The cattle you claim were rebranded. And I need to speak with your witnesses. Garrett's expression was neutral, unreadable. This is a federal investigation now. Both sides get heard. Both sides get examined. And then I make a determination about who's telling the truth and who's going to jail for fraud. Eleanor and Silas exchanged glances. This was exactly what they'd wanted, federal involvement. But Ashcombe had turned it against them, making himself the victim. We'll cooperate fully, Silas said. The evidence is inside. The cattle are in the eastern pasture, and our witnesses are ready to testify. Good. Garrett nodded. Then let's get started. Because if even half of what either of you is claiming is true, somebody's going to hang for this. He said it matter-of-factly, like discussing the weather. And Eleanor realized that the war wasn't over after all. It was just beginning. Marshal Garrett spent 2 days examining everything. He went through the ledgers line by line, asking Eleanor to explain every notation, every calculation, every conclusion she'd drawn. He interviewed Diego, Tommy, and each ranch hand separately. He rode out to the eastern pasture and personally examined the rebranded cattle, taking his own photographs with equipment he'd brought from Denver. Eleanor watched him work with growing anxiety. The man was thorough. She'd give him that. But thorough could cut either way. If he believed Ashcomb's version of events, that she was a con artist who'd manipulated Silas, then everything they'd built would collapse. On the 3rd day, Garrett asked to speak with Eleanor alone. They sat in the main room, the marshal on one side of the table and Eleanor on the other. His face gave away nothing. He'd probably played poker with better liars than she'd ever meet. Tell me about the photograph, he said. Eleanor's stomach tightened. What photograph? The one you sent Mr. Crowley before you arrived. Colonel Ashcombe claims you misrepresented yourself to secure a marriage proposal from a vulnerable man. Is that true? There was no point lying. Garrett would find out anyway. Yes. The photograph I sent wasn't of me. It was my cousin's. Why? Because I was desperate. I had no money, no family, nowhere to go. I thought if I could just get here, I could prove myself through work instead of appearance. So you did deceive him? Yes. Garrett made a note. And when you arrived, Mr. Crowley didn't send you back. No, he gave me a chance. Why? Eleanor met his gaze directly. You'd have to ask him. I did. He said you saved one of his ranch hands from losing his leg. Said you were the hardest worker he'd ever seen. Said you fixed his books and ran his household better than anyone had in years. Garrett leaned back. Ashcombe says you did all that to gain his trust so you could manipulate him into believing these theft allegations. Ashcombe's lying. Maybe. Or maybe you're a very clever woman who saw an opportunity. The marshal's expression didn't change. Here's my problem, Mrs. Whitmore. The evidence you've gathered is compelling. Those brands have definitely been altered. The financial records do show suspicious patterns. But I've also got witnesses from Ashcomb's ranch who claim they saw you and Mr. Crowley's men tampering with cattle brands 3 weeks ago. Eleanor's blood went cold. That's not true. They're willing to testify under oath. They're lying for Ashcombe. He owns them. Probably. But I can't prove that any more than I can prove you're telling the truth. Garrett closed his notebook. What I've got is 2 competing narratives. Both have evidence, both have witnesses. Both sides claim the other is lying. So what happens now? Now I finish my investigation. I talk to the stockyard managers in Denver, check the shipping records, see if Ashcomb's sales numbers actually match his breeding records like you claim they don't. I interview more witnesses, people who don't work for either of you, and then I make a recommendation to the territorial attorney about whether to bring charges. He stood. That process will take weeks, maybe months. And in the meantime, both of you stay on your respective properties. No contact, no confrontations. If I find out either side has been intimidating witnesses or tampering with evidence, I'll arrest everyone involved and let a judge sort it out. Eleanor walked him to the door. Marshal Garrett? He paused. I know how this looks. I know my past makes me easy to doubt. But everything I've told you is true. Ashcombe has been stealing from this ranch for years. He burned our pasture. He's tried to run us off our own land. Her voice was steady despite the fear churning in her gut. If you let him get away with this, he'll do it to someone else, and then someone else, until he owns everything and everyone in this valley. Garrett studied her face for a long moment. I've been doing this job for 12 years, Mrs. Whitmore. I've learned that the truth usually lives somewhere between what both sides are claiming. The question is whether I can find it before someone gets killed. He tipped his hat and left. Silas was waiting in the yard. What did he say? Eleanor told him everything. When she finished, Silas's jaw was tight. Ashcomb's witnesses are lying. We were never tampering with brands. I know, but we can't prove they're lying any more than they can prove we were. So we just wait? Hope Garrett figures it out? We don't have another choice. Silas kicked at the dirt, frustrated. This is wrong. We did everything right. We gathered evidence, we went through proper channels, and now we're being treated like criminals. Welcome to how the law works when you're fighting someone with money. Eleanor's voice was bitter. She'd seen it before in Kansas, when her father had tried to collect payment from wealthy clients who simply refused to pay. The law protected those who could afford lawyers, not those who were right. Diego approached from the barn. The marshal's heading back to town, left 2 deputies camped on the ridge. Says they're here to make sure there's no trouble. More like here to watch us, Silas muttered. Probably both. Diego looked at Eleanor. You holding up? I'm fine. You're a terrible liar. For someone who successfully lied about a photograph, you're remarkably bad at lying about your feelings. Despite everything, Eleanor almost smiled. I'm worried. Is that what you want to hear? It's honest, at least. Diego glanced at Silas. We need to talk about what happens if this goes bad. If Garrett decides to believe Ashcombe. Then we're finished, Silas said flatly. Not necessarily. We could sell the ranch, take what money's left, start over somewhere else. Run away, you mean? Survive, I mean. There's no shame in knowing when you're beaten. Silas shook his head. My father built this ranch from nothing. He died trying to protect it. I'm not giving it up because some corrupt bastard hired better liars than we did. Noble sentiment, but nobility doesn't stop a hanging rope. The words hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor had been trying not to think about that possibility. That Garrett might actually recommend charges against them instead of Ashcombe. That she might end up in a territorial prison for fraud, or worse. But hearing Diego say it out loud made it real. We're not there yet, she said quietly. Garrett's still investigating. We have to trust the evidence will speak for itself. And if it doesn't? Eleanor didn't have an answer for that. The next week crawled by. The deputies stayed on the ridge, watching. No word came from Denver. The ranch work continued, cattle needed tending regardless of federal investigations, but everything felt suspended, like they were all holding their breath waiting for something terrible to happen. Tommy's leg had healed enough that he could walk without limping, though Diego still wouldn't let him ride. The boy spent most of his time in the house, copying documents and asking questions Eleanor couldn't answer. What if Marshal Garrett believes the colonel? He asked one afternoon. Then we deal with it. But how? If the law's on his side, what can we do? Eleanor set down the potato she was peeling. Tommy, you remember when you broke your leg? When everyone was panicking and you were screaming? Yeah. Did panicking fix your leg? No. Did screaming make the bone heal faster? No. Exactly. Sometimes all you can do is set things as right as you can and then wait for the healing to happen. She picked up another potato. We did what we could. We gathered evidence. We told the truth. Now we wait. I hate waiting. Everyone does, but that's all we've got right now. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep again. She kept thinking about Garrett's words, that both sides had evidence, both had witnesses. What if he couldn't determine who was telling the truth? What if he decided it was too murky to prosecute anyone and just walked away? Ashcombe would win by default. He'd keep the stolen cattle, keep his reputation, and probably come after the ranch again within a year. She was sitting on the porch in the dark when Silas found her. Can't sleep? He asked. Got too good at it when I first arrived. Now my body thinks 3 hours is plenty. He sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. You should try to rest. This waiting is hard enough without being exhausted. I know. My brain just won't stop running through possibilities. All bad ones, I'm guessing. Mostly, yeah. Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter against the night cold. I keep thinking about what Diego said, about knowing when you're beaten. You think we're beaten? I think we might be. I think we did everything right, and it still might not be enough because Ashcombe has more money and better connections and a history that makes him look respectable. She turned to look at Silas. I'm sorry I got you into this. You didn't get me into anything. I was already in it. I just didn't know how deep. Silas was quiet for a moment. Eleanor, can I ask you something? Sure. If Garrett decides against us, if we lose the ranch, what will you do? Eleanor had been trying not to think about that. I don't know. Find work somewhere. Try to survive. Would you stay? With me? The question caught her off guard. What? I mean, Silas seemed to be choosing his words carefully. When you first arrived, this was supposed to be a business arrangement, marriage in exchange for a home, but it's been months now and we still haven't. He stopped, frustrated. What I'm asking is whether you're here because you have nowhere else to go or because you want to be here. Eleanor's heart was beating too fast. Does it matter? Yeah, it does. She looked at him in the darkness. This man who'd almost sent her away, who'd given her a chance when he had every reason not to, who'd listened to her wild theories and trusted her judgment, even when it meant risking everything. I want to be here, she said quietly. I stopped thinking of this as a transaction weeks ago. Good. Because so did I. He took her hand. His palm was rough with calluses, warm against her fingers. They sat there in the dark, not talking, just being present with each other while the whole world felt like it was waiting to collapse. If we lose everything, Silas said finally, at least we lose it together. That's a terrible comfort. It's all I've got. Eleanor squeezed his hand. Then I'll take it. 2 days later, riders appeared on the eastern horizon. 6 of them, moving fast. For a moment, Eleanor thought it was Ashcombe's men coming to finish what they'd started. But then she recognized the lead horse. Marshal Garrett was back. He dismounted in the yard, his face grim. Diego appeared from the barn, Silas from the house. They all gathered in tense silence while Garrett pulled documents from his saddlebag. I've completed my investigation, he said without preamble. Talked to the stockyard managers in Denver, examined 5 years of shipping records, interviewed 12 witnesses who don't work for either of you. Eleanor held her breath. Colonel Ashcombe has been running a sophisticated cattle theft operation for at least 6 years, possibly longer. He's been stealing small numbers from multiple ranches, rebranding them, and selling them through various stockyards to avoid detection. Based on the shipping records alone, I estimate he's stolen somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 head over that period. Relief flooded through Eleanor so fast she felt dizzy. The evidence you provided was instrumental, Garrett continued, looking at her. The financial analysis in particular. I showed it to an accountant in Denver, and he confirmed your conclusions. Ashcombe's been showing profits that don't match his actual cattle production. So you're arresting him? Silas asked. Federal marshals arrested him yesterday afternoon. He's currently in custody in Denver awaiting trial on charges of interstate cattle fraud, theft, conspiracy, and arson. Garrett pulled out another document. His ranch has been seized as evidence. His bank account's frozen. And I've got warrants out for 4 of his men who participated in the scheme. Diego let out a long breath. Madre de Dios. The territorial attorney wants you both to testify at trial, Garrett said. You, Mrs. Whitmore, in particular. He thinks your financial analysis will be crucial to the prosecution. Of course. Whatever you need. Garrett nodded, then looked at Eleanor with something that might have been respect. I have to admit, when I first got here, I thought there was a good chance Ashcombe was right about you. Con artist playing a long game. But I was wrong. You're just someone who knows how to look at numbers and see the truth hiding in them. My father taught me that, Eleanor said. Numbers don't care who's rich or who's powerful. They just tell you what happened. Well, these numbers are going to put a corrupt colonel in prison for a long time. Garrett tipped his hat. I'll be in touch about trial dates. In the meantime, you folks can get back to running your ranch without worrying about fires or stolen cattle. He mounted and rode off with his deputies, leaving them standing in the yard. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Diego started laughing. We won. We actually won. We survived, Silas corrected. That's not quite the same thing. Close enough. Diego clapped him on the shoulder. I'm getting the whiskey. This deserves a drink. He headed to the house, leaving Eleanor and Silas alone in the yard. The sun was setting behind the mountains, turning the sky orange and pink. It was beautiful in that sharp-edged way Colorado sunsets were beautiful. You could appreciate it, but you never forgot how harsh this place could be. You did it, Silas said quietly. We did it. No. This was you. I would have taken Ashcombe's offer or gotten myself killed trying to fight him head-on. You're the one who saw the pattern, who built the case, who stood up to him when everyone else was too scared. Silas turned to face her fully. I don't know how to thank you for that. You already did. You trusted me when you had every reason not to. I almost didn't, but you did. That's what matters. They stood there as the sunset deepened, and Eleanor realized something had shifted. The tension that had been hanging over the ranch for months was finally gone. They could breathe again. Plan for the future instead of just trying to survive the present. So what happens now? She asked. Now we rebuild. Get the ranch back on solid footing. Maybe expand if the cattle prices recover. Silas paused. And we figure out what we are to each other. Eleanor's pulse quickened. What do you want us to be? Actually married, not just in name. He met her eyes. If that's what you want. Eleanor thought about the photograph she'd sent, the lies she'd told, the desperate gamble that had brought her here. She'd been so certain she was worthless, too plain, too broad, too unmarketable for any man to actually want. But Silas wasn't looking at her like she was a compromise or a mistake. He was looking at her like she was exactly what he'd been hoping for. Yeah, she said. That's what I want. He smiled, really smiled, for the first time since she'd met him. Then he pulled her close and kissed her while the Colorado sunset blazed around them. When they finally broke apart, Diego was standing on the porch holding a bottle of whiskey and grinning like a fool. About damn time, he called out. Now get in here and celebrate before I drink all of this myself. The trial took place 6 weeks later in Denver. Eleanor testified for 2 full days, walking the jury through the financial evidence, explaining how she'd identified the pattern of theft, showing them the rebranded cattle photographs. Ashcombe's lawyers tried to tear her apart on cross-examination, questioning her background, her deception about the photograph, her motives for accusing such a prominent citizen. But Eleanor had faced worse than hostile lawyers. She'd faced Ashcombe himself, armed and dangerous, in front of half the valley. This was nothing. She answered every question calmly and precisely. When the lead defense attorney tried to suggest she'd falsified the financial records, she walked him through the math step by step until he had no choice but to admit the numbers added up. When another lawyer implied she'd been sleeping with Silas and manipulated him emotionally, she looked the man dead in the eye and said, I'm not the one on trial for theft, counselor. Your client is. The jury loved her. Silas testified after Eleanor, confirming the timeline and the impact on his ranch. Diego testified about finding the rebranded cattle. The stockyard managers testified about the suspicious sales patterns. The evidence piled up until even Ashcomb's expensive legal team couldn't pretend there was reasonable doubt. The jury deliberated for 3 hours, guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Ashcombe to 15 years in federal prison. His ranch was sold at auction, the proceeds going to compensate the ranchers he'd stolen from. 4 of his men were convicted as accomplices and sentenced to prison terms ranging from 3 to 8 years. The Denver Post ran the story on the front page. Decorated colonel exposed as cattle thief, mail-order bride cracks the case. Eleanor hated that headline. The phrase mail-order bride made it sound like she'd been shipped in a crate. But she couldn't deny it was accurate, technically speaking. They returned to the ranch in early November. Winter was coming. You could smell it in the air, see it in the way the cattle started moving to lower pastures. But this time, Eleanor wasn't worried about whether they'd survive until spring. With the compensation money from Ashcomb's seized assets, Silas had paid off his father's debts and had enough left over to hire 2 more hands and buy breeding stock. The ranch was going to make it. A week after they returned, they had the wedding. It wasn't much. Just Diego, the ranch hands, a few neighboring families, and a traveling preacher who happened to be passing through. Eleanor wore the same dusty rose dress she'd arrived in, freshly mended. Silas wore his only suit, which didn't fit quite right across the shoulders. The ceremony took place on the porch at sunset. Eleanor had worried it would feel strange, finally making official something they'd both been thinking of as real for months. But when the preacher asked if she took Silas as her husband, and she said yes, it felt exactly right. That night, alone in Silas's room, their room now, Eleanor finally let herself believe she'd found what she'd been looking for when she answered that advertisement. Not just survival, not just a roof over her head, but a home, a partner, a future that was more than just getting through the next day. "What are you thinking about?" Silas asked. They were lying in bed, his arm around her, her head on his chest. Outside, the wind was picking up. First snow would probably come within the week. "I'm thinking about that photograph," she said. "The one I sent you, the lie that started all of this." "What about it?" "I spent my whole life thinking I wasn't enough. Not pretty enough, not delicate enough. Not the kind of woman men wrote poems about. So I sent you someone else's picture because I thought you'd never want the real me. And I was wrong. You didn't want the picture. You wanted someone who could work, who could think, who could stand beside you when things got hard." Eleanor propped herself up on one elbow. "I thought I had to be someone else to be wanted. Turns out I just had to be myself." Silas tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "That photograph did me a favor, actually." "How do you figure?" "If you'd sent a real picture, I might have said yes for the wrong reasons. Because you looked pleasant or seemed respectable. Instead, you showed up looking different than I expected, and I had to decide based on who you actually were instead of what you looked like." He smiled slightly. "Turns out that was better. Even when I was standing there covered in Tommy's blood, setting his leg while you all panicked? Especially then, that's when I knew you were stronger than anyone I'd ever met." Eleanor kissed him, slow and deep, letting herself feel everything she'd been too scared to feel for months. When they finally broke apart, she was smiling. "What?" Silas asked. "I'm just happy. Is that allowed? I think we've earned it." They lay there listening to the wind, warm under the quilts, safe in a house they'd fought to keep. Tomorrow there would be work, cattle to move before the snow, supplies to inventory, 100 small tasks that made up ranch life. But tonight, there was just this. Just them. Just the quiet certainty that they'd survived the worst and come out the other side together. Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall. Winter came hard that year. Snow piled up against the barn doors, ice formed on the water troughs every morning, and the temperature dropped so low that breathing felt like swallowing broken glass. But the ranch held. The cattle survived in the lower pastures where Diego had moved them. The supplies Eleanor had inventoried and rationed lasted through January and into February. And the house, reinforced and winterized with money from the Ashcombe settlement, stayed warm even when the wind howled like something alive and angry. Eleanor learned what frontier winter actually meant. It meant days when you couldn't see the barn from the house because of blowing snow. It meant checking on livestock in conditions that could kill you if you got turned around. It meant cabin fever setting in among the ranch hands, tempers flaring over nothing, Diego breaking up fights in the bunkhouse at least once a week. But it also meant quiet evenings with Silas, the two of them going over ranch plans for spring while the fire crackled and the wind rattled the windows. It meant learning to bake bread that didn't come out dense as a brick. It meant Tommy teaching her to play poker with a deck of cards, so worn the suits were barely visible. "You're terrible at this," Tommy said one night, scooping up her bet. "I'm aware. You keep betting when you've got nothing. That's not strategy. That's just throwing money away." Eleanor looked at her cards, a pair of threes and nothing else worth mentioning. "Sometimes you bet because folding guarantees you lose. Betting at least gives you a chance. That's not how poker works." "Maybe not, but it's how life works." Tommy considered this, then grinned. "Is that why you came here? You were holding a bad hand, so you bet everything?" "Something like that." "Did it work out?" Eleanor glanced at Silas, who was reviewing supply orders at the table. He looked up, caught her eye, and smiled slightly. That same small smile that meant more than grand gestures ever could. "Yeah," she said. "It worked out." The letter from Denver arrived in late February, brought by a courier who'd braved the mountain passes specifically to deliver it. Eleanor recognized the seal immediately, Territorial Court. Her hands shook slightly as she opened it. It was from the prosecutor handling Ashcombe's case. "Dear Mrs. Crowley," it began, "I am writing to inform you that Colonel Victor Ashcombe has filed an appeal of his conviction. His legal team is arguing procedural errors and claiming that key evidence was obtained improperly. A hearing has been scheduled for April 15th to determine whether the appeal has merit. Your presence may be required should the court decide to re-examine the evidence." Eleanor read it twice, then handed it to Silas without speaking. He read it, his jaw tightening with each line. Can they do this? He was convicted. The jury saw everything. "Appeals are standard in major cases," Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Doesn't mean they'll succeed. But they might." "They might." Silas crumpled the letter in his fist. "I'm so damn tired of fighting this man. He's in prison where he belongs, and he's still trying to destroy us. He's desperate. Desperate people do stupid things." Eleanor took the letter from him and smoothed it out. "We beat him once. We can beat him again." "I don't want to beat him again. I want him to stay beaten." "I know, but that's not how this works." Diego had been listening from the doorway. "What do you need?" "Time to prepare, mostly. The hearing's not until April. That gives us 2 months to make sure every piece of evidence is still solid, every witness is still willing to testify." Eleanor looked at Silas. "We documented everything the first time. We just have to do it again. And if the court decides the evidence was obtained improperly, then we find new evidence, or we live with the fact that sometimes bad people win." Eleanor stood. "But I'm not assuming that's going to happen. Not yet." The next 2 months were a strange echo of the previous summer. Eleanor went back through all the financial records, double-checking every calculation. Diego tracked down the ranch hands who'd testified, making sure they'd be available if called again. Tommy, whose leg had healed completely, rode to neighboring ranches gathering additional witness statements from other victims of Ashcombe's theft operation. But there was a weariness to it this time that hadn't been there before. They'd already won this fight. Having to fight it again felt like being punished for doing the right thing. "Why does he get to keep appealing?" Tommy asked one evening. "He was guilty. Everyone knows he was guilty." "Because the law has to protect everyone's rights, even criminals," Eleanor explained. "Otherwise, it's not law. It's just whoever has the most power doing whatever they want. Seems like Ashcombe's doing whatever he wants anyway." "No, he's doing what his lawyers are allowed to do within the system. There's a difference." Eleanor set down the ledger she'd been reviewing. "The law's not perfect, Tommy. It's slow, it's frustrating, and sometimes it feels like it protects the guilty more than the innocent. But it's still better than no law at all." "Is it?" Eleanor thought about that. About vigilante justice and range wars, and the kind of violence that happened when people decided laws didn't apply to them. She'd seen the aftermath in Kansas, feuds that lasted generations, families destroyed, children growing up thinking violence was the only way to solve problems. "Yeah," she said finally. "It is." April came with mud and melting snow and the kind of wet cold that seeped into your bones. Eleanor and Silas made the trip to Denver, leaving Diego in charge of the ranch. The city had grown since Eleanor had last seen it. More buildings, more people, more noise. It made her appreciate the isolation of the ranch, the quiet that let you hear yourself think. The hearing was held in the same courthouse where the original trial had taken place. Ashcombe was brought in wearing prison clothes instead of his expensive suits. He'd lost weight, his silver hair had gone completely white, and there was a hardness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Prison did that to people. It either broke them or made them meaner. Ashcombe had chosen meaner. His lawyers argued that Marshall Garrett had overstepped his authority, that the search of Ashcombe's ranch had been conducted without proper warrants, that witness testimony had been coerced. They were grasping at straws, but they were expensive lawyers who knew how to make straws look like structural beams. Eleanor testified again, answering the same questions she'd answered 6 months ago. Ashcombe's lawyers tried to rattle her, suggesting she'd fabricated evidence to frame an innocent man. She responded with the same calm precision she'd used the first time, walking them through every calculation until their objections sounded hollow, even to them. The hearing lasted 3 days. On the afternoon of the third day, the judge called for a recess to review the arguments. Eleanor and Silas waited in the hallway outside the courtroom, not speaking, just existing in that terrible space between hope and dread. An hour passed, then another. Finally, the bailiff called them back inside. The judge was an older man with gray hair and the kind of face that had seen too much human stupidity to be surprised by anything. He looked at the lawyers, then at Ashcombe, then at Eleanor and Silas. "I've reviewed all arguments and evidence presented," he said. "The defense claims procedural errors in the original investigation and trial. However, I find no evidence that Marshall Garrett acted outside his legal authority. The searches were conducted on probable cause. The witnesses testified voluntarily. And the financial evidence presented by Mrs. Crowley is mathematically sound and independently verifiable." Eleanor felt Silas's hand find hers under the table. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "even if I were to exclude certain evidence on technical grounds, the remaining evidence is still sufficient to support the jury's verdict. The appeal is denied. Colonel Ashcombe will continue serving his sentence as originally determined." The gavel came down with a finality that echoed through the courtroom. Ashcombe's lawyers immediately requested another appeal to a higher court. The judge denied that too, stating that the case had been thoroughly examined and no further appeals would be entertained without extraordinary new evidence. It was over. Really over this time. Ashcombe was led out in chains, his face twisted with rage. As he passed their table, he looked directly at Eleanor. "You ruined me," he said quietly. "You came here with your lies and your schemes, and you destroyed everything I built." Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "You ruined yourself. I just did the math." A guard pulled Ashcombe away before he could respond. Eleanor watched him go, feeling nothing. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Just tired relief that this particular fight was finally finished. Outside the courthouse, Silas stopped on the steps and pulled her close. "It's done," he said. "Actually done." "Yeah. How do you feel?" Eleanor thought about that. "Empty. Like I've been carrying something heavy for so long that putting it down feels strange. Good strange or bad strange? Just strange. I'll get used to it." She looked up at him. "We should go home." They took the train back to Copper Ridge the next morning. The landscape rolled past the windows, plains giving way to foothills, giving way to mountains. Eleanor watched it all, thinking about the route she'd taken in reverse almost a year ago, terrified and desperate, and lying to a man she'd never met. That woman felt like a stranger now. "What are you thinking about?" Silas asked. "How different everything is from when I first arrived. Better different or worse different?" "Definitely better. Though that first day was pretty terrible, so the bar was low." Silas laughed. It was a sound Eleanor had learned to love, genuine and unguarded, so different from the tight-lipped silence of those early weeks. "I was an ass to you that first day. You were a man who'd been lied to. I don't blame you for being angry. I should have given you a chance sooner. You gave me a chance when it mattered. That's what counts." Eleanor leaned against his shoulder. "Besides, if you'd been charming and welcoming, I probably would have thought something was wrong with you." "Fair point." They arrived back at the ranch just before sunset. Diego met them in the yard looking relieved. "How'd it go?" "Appeal denied," Silas said. "Ashcombe stays in prison." "Good. Maybe now we can actually focus on ranching instead of legal battles." Diego gestured toward the eastern pasture. New grass is coming in where the fire was. Should be good grazing by June. Eleanor looked at the burned valley, now showing the first signs of green. Nature recovering from violence the way it always did given enough time. There was something hopeful in that. The ranch settled into its rhythms as spring turned to summer. Calving season came and went with fewer losses than expected. The cattle prices recovered slightly, not back to their peak, but better than the desperate lows of the previous year. Eleanor took over the ranch's books completely, implementing systems that let them track every animal, every expense, every dollar in and out. She was good at it, better than she'd ever been good at anything else. Numbers made sense to her in a way people often didn't. They had rules, patterns, logic. You could trust them to tell you the truth if you knew how to read them properly. But she'd also learned that numbers weren't the only truth that mattered. There was the truth of relationships, of trust built slowly over shared work and shared danger. The truth of belonging somewhere, of being part of something larger than yourself. The truth that sometimes the things you thought made you worthless, being too broad, too plain, too different from what was expected, were exactly what made you valuable. One evening in late June, Eleanor was in the garden pulling weeds when a rider approached. She didn't recognize him at first. A young man, maybe 20, with nervous energy and a courier's satchel. "Mrs. Crowley?" "That's me?" "I've got a letter for you, from Kansas." Eleanor's heart lurched. She hadn't heard from Kansas in over a year, hadn't expected to ever hear from Kansas again. She took the letter, paid the courier, and waited until he'd ridden off before opening it. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. Her Aunt Martha, her mother's sister, the only family Eleanor had left in the world, and not a particularly close one. They'd never gotten along. Martha had disapproved of Eleanor's father, disapproved of his work, disapproved of Eleanor helping him instead of learning to be a proper lady. "Dear Eleanor," the letter began, "I hope this reaches you. I heard from the Johnsons that you'd gone west to marry. I'm writing because I thought you should know that your mother's house sold last month. After settling the debts, there was a small amount left, $53. I'm sending it with this letter, as it's rightfully yours. I also wanted to tell you that I was wrong about you. Your father wrote me several times before he died, and he always spoke of how proud he was of your intelligence and your strength. I dismissed it at the time, thinking he was being overly indulgent, but I see now that he knew you better than I did. I hope you found happiness in Colorado. You deserved better than what Kansas offered you. Your aunt, Martha." Eleanor read the letter 3 times, tears blurring the words. It wasn't an apology exactly. Martha wasn't capable of direct apologies, but it was acknowledgement, recognition, and that was enough. Silas found her there in the garden, crying over a letter and a small envelope containing $53 in bills. "What's wrong?" Eleanor handed him the letter. He read it, then sat down beside her in the dirt. "Your father was right," he said, "about you being intelligent and strong. I didn't always feel that way. Most of my life, I felt like a mistake, like I'd been built wrong, shaped wrong, expected to fit into spaces that weren't designed for someone like me. And now I know the spaces were wrong, not me. I just had to find the right place." Eleanor wiped her eyes. $53. That's all that's left of the life I had before. What are you going to do with it? Eleanor thought about that. $53 was enough to buy supplies, fix equipment, invest in the ranch. Or she could save it, keep it as emergency money in case everything went wrong again. But she'd spent too much of her life being scared of what might go wrong. "I'm going to buy breeding hens," she said. "Good ones, so we can have fresh eggs year-round instead of rationing them all winter." Silas smiled. "That's the most practical thing I've ever heard." "I'm a practical woman." "Yeah, you are." He kissed her forehead. "That's one of the things I love about you." It was the first time either of them had used that word. Love. It hung in the air between them, terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. "I love you too," Eleanor said. "Even though you were terrible to me that first day. I'll spend the rest of my life making up for it. I'll hold you to that." They sat in the garden as the sun set, covered in dirt, talking about breeding hens and garden plans and all the small, ordinary things that made up a life. It wasn't romantic in the way poems described romance. There were no grand gestures or sweeping declarations, just two people who'd found each other through desperation and lies and fear, and somehow built something real out of all that broken foundation. The summer passed into fall. The ranch had its best year in a decade. Cattle sales were strong, the compensation money from Ashcombe's seizure had been invested wisely, and for the first time since his father's death, Silas could pay his hands properly and still have money left over. Eleanor kept the books, managed the household, and discovered she had a talent for negotiating with suppliers in town. The same shopkeepers who'd stared at her with disgust when she'd first arrived now greeted her by name and gave her fair prices. Respect, she'd learned, wasn't something you were born with or given. It was something you earned through work and integrity and refusing to quit when things got hard. In October, Eleanor realized she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks but hadn't said anything, wanting to be certain before she got Silas's hopes up. When the doctor in town confirmed it, she rode back to the ranch trying to figure out how to tell him. In the end, she just walked up to him in the barn and said it straight. "I'm pregnant." Silas dropped the tool he was holding. "What?" "Pregnant. Baby. Due sometime in April, the doctor thinks." For a moment, Silas just stared at her. Then he picked her up and spun her around, laughing like a man who'd just discovered gold. "Careful," Eleanor protested. "I'm trying not to throw up on you." Sorry. He set her down but kept his hands on her waist. "Are you happy?" "Terrified mostly, but yeah, I'm happy." Me too. Silas kissed her, then pulled back. "Should you be working? Do you need a rest? What does the doctor say?" "The doctor says I'm healthy and should continue my normal activities until I can't anymore, which means I'm still doing the books, still managing the household, and still telling you when you're being ridiculous." Fair enough. The news spread through the ranch within hours. Diego congratulated them with tears in his eyes, saying the ranch had needed new life for too long. Tommy immediately started planning to build a cradle, despite having no carpentry experience whatsoever. The other ranch hands alternated between congratulations and nervous jokes about babies crying at night. Eleanor took it all in stride. She'd faced down a criminal colonel, testified in federal court, and survived a Colorado winter. A baby seemed manageable by comparison. But as her pregnancy progressed through the winter months, she realized it was harder than she'd expected. The nausea lasted well into her 4th month. Her back ached constantly. And the fear, the deep, primal fear that something would go wrong, never quite went away. "What if I'm bad at this?" she asked Silas one night. "What if I'm good at numbers and ranching and standing up to criminals, but terrible at being a mother? Then you'll learn. Same way you learned everything else. Babies don't come with ledgers I can balance." "No. But they come with you as their mother. That's better than any ledger." Silas put his hand on her swollen belly. "This kid's going to be the luckiest child in Colorado. Smart mother, stubborn mother, brave mother. What more could they need? Food, clothing, a roof that doesn't leak. We've got all that. We'll figure out the rest." Eleanor wanted to believe him. Some days she did. Other days, the fear won. But she kept moving forward anyway because that's what she'd always done. The baby came early, on a cold morning in late March. Eleanor had been cleaning the kitchen when her water broke, soaking her dress and the floor, and sending her into immediate panic. "Silas!" she shouted. "Silas!" He came running, saw the water, and went pale. Are you? Get the doctor. Now!" Diego rode to town while Silas helped Eleanor to bed. The contractions started soon after, sharp, brutal, nothing like the books had described. She'd set Tommy's broken leg without flinching, but this was different. This was her own body betraying her, squeezing and cramping and hurting in ways that made her wonder if something was wrong. The doctor arrived 2 hours later. By then, Eleanor was certain she was dying. "First babies take time," the doctor said calmly. "You're doing fine." "I'm not doing fine. Nothing about this is fine. Breathe through the contractions. Push when I tell you. You're stronger than you think." 12 hours later, Eleanor delivered a healthy baby girl. She was tiny and red and screaming at full volume, furious at being pulled from the warm darkness into the cold, bright world. The doctor cleaned the baby and handed her to Eleanor. "Congratulations, Mrs. Crowley. You have a daughter." Eleanor looked down at the small, angry face and felt something crack open in her chest. Love, immediate and fierce and terrifying. This tiny person was hers to protect, to raise, to keep safe in a world that could be brutal and unfair and hard. "She's perfect," she whispered. "She is," Silas agreed from beside the bed. He was crying, not even trying to hide it. What should we name her? Eleanor had thought about this for months. She wanted something strong, something that would remind her daughter that she could be whoever she wanted to be, regardless of what the world expected. "Margaret," she said, "after my cousin, the one whose photograph I sent." Silas nodded. "Margaret Crowley. I like it. Maggie for short. Even better." They sat there with their daughter, exhausted and elated, while outside the March snow fell soft and quiet. Diego poked his head in eventually, asking if everyone was all right. "We're perfect," Eleanor said. And in that moment, despite everything she'd been through, despite all the fear and uncertainty and struggle, she meant it. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought warmth and green grass and the kind of days that made you forget how harsh winter had been. Eleanor recovered slowly from childbirth, discovering that raising an infant was indeed harder than balancing ledgers. Maggie cried at odd hours, refused to sleep when she should, and demanded constant attention in ways that made Eleanor understand why some women went slightly crazy in those early months. But there was joy in it too. The first time Maggie smiled, really smiled, not just gas, Eleanor's heart nearly burst. The first time the baby recognized her voice and stopped crying just from hearing it, Eleanor felt something shift. She was needed, not just useful, but genuinely needed by this small person who depended on her completely. "You're good at this," Silas observed one evening. Eleanor was walking the floor with Maggie, trying to get her to sleep. "I'm exhausted and covered in spit up. I'm not good at anything right now. You kept her alive and healthy. You're feeding her, keeping her clean, making sure she's warm and safe. That's being good at it. That's just basic survival. Most of life is basic survival. You're just better at it than most people." Eleanor thought about that as she rocked her daughter. Maybe that was all any of them were doing, surviving, one day at a time, doing the best they could with what they had. Maybe that was enough. 2 years passed. Maggie learned to walk, then to run, then to climb things she absolutely should not be climbing. She had Eleanor's sturdy build and Silas's dark hair and a personality that suggested she'd inherited stubbornness from both sides of the family. The ranch continued to prosper. Silas bought more land when a neighboring rancher retired and moved back east. Eleanor's financial management had built up enough reserves that they could weather bad years without panic. Diego was getting older but refused to retire, claiming he'd die if he stopped working. Tommy married a girl from town and brought her to the ranch to help with the household work, giving Eleanor time to focus on the books and on Maggie. Life settled into patterns. Good patterns. The kind that made you realize you'd built something worth keeping. One afternoon in late summer, Eleanor was on the porch watching Maggie chase chickens when a familiar figure rode up. Marshall Garrett, older and grayer than when she'd last seen him, but still carrying himself with that same quiet authority. "Mrs. Crowley." "Marshall." "What brings you all the way out here?" Garrett dismounted and removed his hat. "Wanted to tell you in person. Colonel Ashcombe died in prison 3 days ago. Heart failure." Eleanor felt nothing. No satisfaction, no relief, just a distant acknowledgement that a chapter had finally, truly closed. "Thank you for letting me know. Thought you'd want to hear it from me rather than reading it in some newspaper." Garrett looked around the ranch. "Place looks good, prosperous. We've had some good years. You've earned them." He mounted his horse again. "That case changed things, you know. Other women started coming forward saying Ashcombe had stolen from their families, too. We opened investigations in 3 other territories. Your courage in standing up to him made a difference for a lot of people." "I wasn't being courageous. I was just trying to survive." "Sometimes that's the same thing." Garrett tipped his hat. "Take care, Mrs. Crowley." He rode off, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts. Maggie ran up, chickens forgotten, and grabbed Eleanor's hand. "Mama, I'm hungry." "Then let's get you something to eat." They went inside together, Maggie chattering about chickens and horses and a butterfly she'd seen. Eleanor listened with half her attention, the other half thinking about what Garrett had said. That her fight had mattered to other people. That standing up when it would have been easier to run had made a difference. She'd never thought about it that way. She'd just been doing what needed to be done, solving the problem in front of her the way she solved any problem, with logic and determination and a refusal to quit. But maybe that was enough. Maybe you didn't need to be a hero to make a difference. You just needed to be willing to do the work when everyone else was too scared or too tired or too convinced they'd lose. That evening, after Maggie was in bed and the house was quiet, Eleanor and Silas sat on the porch watching the sunset. It was their ritual now, these quiet moments at the end of the day. Time to decompress, to talk about nothing important, to just exist together. Garrett came by today, Eleanor said. Ashcombe died in prison. Silas was quiet for a moment. How do you feel about that? I don't know. Empty, maybe? He tried to destroy us, and we beat him. Now he's dead. End of story. Is it? What do you mean? I mean, is it really the end, or is it just the end of that particular chapter? Silas looked at her. We've got a daughter, a prosperous ranch, a life we've built together. Ashcombe's just a footnote now. The real story is what we do next. Eleanor smiled. When did you become philosophical? Must have picked it up from my wife. She's annoyingly good at making me think about things. One of my many talents. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the light fade from orange to purple to deep blue. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. Closer, cattle were settling for the night. The sounds of the ranch, familiar and comforting after all this time. You know what I think about sometimes? Eleanor said. That first day? When I stepped off the train and saw your face, saw the whole town staring at me like I was some kind of circus attraction. I was an ass. You were hurt and angry. I'd lied to you. You had every right to be upset. Eleanor leaned against his shoulder. But you let me stay anyway. You gave me a chance to prove myself. That changed everything. You would have found another way. You're too stubborn to fail. Maybe. But I wouldn't have found this. She gestured at the ranch, the mountains, everything they'd built. Wouldn't have found you, wouldn't have Maggie. Wouldn't have learned that I could be more than what Kansas told me I was worth. Silas put his arm around her. Kansas was stupid for not seeing your value. Kansas had very specific ideas about what made a woman valuable. I didn't fit those ideas. Eleanor paused. But Colorado didn't care about Kansas's ideas. Colorado just cared whether you could work hard and survive harsh conditions and stand your ground when someone tried to push you around. Turns out, I was good at all those things. The best I've ever seen. They sat there until full dark, then went inside to the life they'd built from desperation and deception and determination. It wasn't a perfect life. Perfection was a fairy tale for children. But it was real, it was earned, and it was theirs. Years later, when Maggie was old enough to ask questions, Eleanor told her the story. Not a sanitized version, but the truth. She told her about the photograph that wasn't hers, about showing up to meet a man she'd lied to, about being judged by an entire town before they'd even spoken to her. She told her about setting Tommy's leg, uncovering Ashcombe's theft, facing down armed men in a burned valley, while half the territory watched. Were you scared? Maggie asked. Terrified. Every day. But being scared doesn't mean you quit. It just means you keep moving forward, even though you're afraid. Why didn't you go back to Kansas? Because there was nothing for me there. And because I knew that if I ran every time things got hard, I'd spend my whole life running. Eleanor looked at her daughter. Sometimes the only way to find out who you really are is to put yourself in a situation where you have to be stronger than you think you can be. Did you find out who you really are? Eleanor thought about that. About the frightened woman who'd stepped off the train in a borrowed dress and mended gloves. About the woman who'd set bones and balanced ledgers and stood up to criminals. About the woman she was now, wife, mother, rancher, survivor. Yeah, she said. I did. Turns out I'm someone who doesn't quit. Someone who sees problems and solves them instead of complaining about them. Someone who's stronger than she looks and smarter than people expect. She smiled at Maggie. And I hope you grow up to be the same kind of person, not because the world will be easy. It won't be. But because you'll know you can handle whatever it throws at you. Maggie considered this seriously. What if I can't? Then you figure it out anyway. Same way I did. Same way everyone does. Eleanor stood. Now go help your father with the evening feeding. Those cattle don't care about our philosophical discussions." Maggie ran off, and Eleanor went back to the ledgers waiting on the desk. The ranch accounts, carefully maintained, telling the story of another successful year. Numbers that showed growth, stability, prosperity earned through hard work and smart decisions. She ran her finger down the columns, checking calculations, noting patterns. The same skills she'd used to uncover Ashcombe's crimes now applied to building something instead of tearing something down. It felt right. It felt like the work she was meant to do. Outside, the sun was setting over the mountains. The same mountains that had seemed so harsh and foreign when she'd first arrived. Now they just looked like home. Eleanor closed the ledger and went to join her family for dinner. Tomorrow there would be more work. There was always more work on a ranch. But tonight, there was just this. A meal shared with people she loved, in a home she'd fought to keep, in a life she'd built from nothing but desperation and determination. She'd come west expecting to have to pretend to be someone else to survive. Instead, she'd discovered that being herself, stubborn, practical, unbreakable, was exactly what this place needed. The frontier didn't care if you were pretty or delicate or exactly what society said a woman should be. It just cared if you could handle the work and stand your ground when things got hard. Eleanor could do both, and that, in the end, was worth more than any photograph.